Namaste, Vanakkam, Salam, Sawubona. My name is Leena and I am an occupational therapist with a passion for our Indian heritage and the journey of our forefathers during the years of Indian indenture to South Africa. Join me on a 3-part mini-series as we pay tribute to the women of indenture, the untold or perhaps forgotten stories of hardship, suffering and eventual triumph over the oppressive system. A trans-oceanic journey between the motherland of India and the east coast of South Africa. Welcome to part 1, Life in India, the recruitment process and departure to Africa. Historically, sati, the oppressive practice whereby recently widowed women, either voluntarily or by coercion, committed suicide by immolating or burning herself on her husband's funeral pyre, peaked among certain Hindu castes in India around 1000 AD. It declined thereafter, only to become rife once again between 1526 and 1857, typically amongst the Kshatriya or warrior families. Sati was eventually outlawed by the Bengal provincial government in 1829 with the collaborative efforts of Raja Ram Mohan Roy and the then Governor-General of India at the time, Lord William Bentinck. Furthermore, the life of many a Hindu widow was harsh. She was not allowed to remarry and had to live out her days under the jurisdiction of her in-laws. Young child brides were not immune either, doomed to a life of servitude in the household of their in-laws, should they too find themselves widowed as a young child. These young widows, together with other vulnerable women, determined to break the cycle of poverty, abuse, and even prostitution, were the perfect targets, wouldn't you say, for a deceitful Arkati or recruiter, determined to fulfill the 29% quota of women for each shipload of indentured labourers leaving the ports of India, destined for the promised land of South Africa. These women agreed of their own volition to brave the capricious tides of the Kala Pani or black water with the lure and promise of a better life in a land where they will be provided with comfortable housing, medical care, meals, and most importantly, freedom. Freedom from oppression and the freedom to redefine who they were. This is the Women of Indenture, the untold stories of abuse, exploitation, rape, murder, and even suicide. These stories of humiliation, abuse, degradation are not common knowledge and further magnify the struggle against gender-based violence or GBV, not just from the time of indenture, but centuries prior. Contrary to popular belief that the first Indians to arrive in South Africa were the indentured Indians, the first Indians arrived in the Dutch Cape Colony in 1653. Mary was a woman from Bengal who was bought to be a slave for Jan van Riebeeck in 1653 in Batavia. One of the most famous early slaves at the Cape was Angela or Engela from Bengal, captured from the Ganges Delta that we now know as West Bengal. The Dutch had slaver stations in Sri Lanka, coast of Coromandel and Bengal, with the slaves arriving in the Cape and St. Helena via Mauritius. Many white settlers married or lived with Asian women, and their children were accepted in the white community. Simon van der Staal was one of 2 Cape governors who would have said to be coloured. His father, Adrian van der Staal, a Dutch commander of Mauritius, was married to Maria Levens, a free slave Indian woman from Goa. Between 1860 and 1911, an excess of 70 ships made 384 trips between India and the British colony of Port Natal. The Truro, Belvedere, Umtata, Pongola, and Umvoti were among the first ships carrying indentured labour to leave the shores of Madras and Calcutta. The women on board these vessels were married, single, widowed, some pregnant out of wedlock, prostitutes, and even young lovers escaping the wrath of their families. One such couple in late 1881 was Kandasamy Naikan and Tanji of Navalpur in the former North Arcot, Tamil Nadu. Now initially, it was only the male labourers that the British commissioned. However, after much debate, women were allowed to accompany the menfolk. The British, you see, regarded the women and children as a hindrance and a burden. Due to it being more challenging to recruit women versus men, Arkatis or recruiters received a larger premium or incentive for each successful female recruitment. Women recruited from places of worship, markets, bazaars, and even railway stations. Once the girmit or agreement was signed, one could not get out of the contract. Many women were deceived or exploited right from the start of recruitment, at the depots, during the voyage across the Pagla Samundar, at the plantations, and even in their own living quarters. It was endless. We are now joined by Professor Amba Pandey, Research Officer at the School of International Studies based at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India, as she sheds more light on the circumstances surrounding these women, defying traditional gender stereotypes at the time in order to embark on this journey of indenture and migration.
Hello everyone. Before I start giving my views, let me congratulate Leena Bachu for this initiative and thank her for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Coming to the point, as to what prompted these women to migrate, to break the contemporary social, the prevailing social conditions, the religious taboos, and migrate. I think this question has to be looked in from a broader perspective. Uh, there were several factors at play at that time which prompted these women. There is no doubt that deceptions, kidnappings, forceful recruitments were taking place, especially in the initial years. But to think that more this kind of deceptions could continue for more than 8 decades is would be a wrong understanding because information was circulating, indenture system, its evils, the exploitation that women were facing were actually part of the national movement in India. And naturally, we know that information was circulating, and these women were must have made informed choices, at least in the later years uh, 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 when migration was taking place and returnees were coming back and again migrating. So the circular kind of process that were happening must have informed these women. But still, uh, they decided to migrate, and then this question comes as to what actually made them to decide. And here there are several factors that has to be looked into, and especially in the context of colonialism and colonial policies. Because very often we take the conversation away from that, but actually it is closely related to that. Uh, One thing which is very clear is that these women were brave, and brave women are not rare in Indian society. They have been there despite the patriarchal order. But why they decided to migrate, and that actually has to be seen, as I said, in the colonial context. Actually, the colonial policies, economic and social, all shattered the existing order. We know that village economy got shattered, the local industries, the agricultural system, everything underwent change to suit the colonial masters, and that actually created lot of displacement, lot of exploitation. The villages shattering of the village economy meant that these men were converted into daily wagers, almost daily wagers. And apart from the economy, even the social order, the legal system, everything was undergoing a change. Uh, to give you an example, when the British decided to bring the social order, what they chose was the patriarchal Brahmanical texts, which was actually not prevalent in India at that time. Indian system was being governed by the local laws, which were very often quite liberal to women. But as these changes were coming, the biggest victims were the women. I think it is very important to see this question from the context of other factors that were operating in the Indian society and why these women decided to migrate. But this, I'm very sure that when they decided, they were completely unaware of the extreme exploitation and abuse that was going to follow during their process of migration and the plantations. And there has been, although unfortunately not much research has been done in India on the exploitative conditions, but we do come across several accounts coming from the colonies, the former colonies, from the plantation colonies. The records say about the stories of exploitation. Uh, but one more thing I would like to add here, that apart from what they faced, equally damaging was the typecast, was the labeling that was done to present these women as immoral beings. I think it was a big damage and which continued till recently. A big damage was done to their reputation, to their dignity, to their honor by branding them as certain kind of women who were, as per the British explanations, they were fallen beings. And this narrative continued till very recently, when this whole conversation shifted towards bringing the women's issue, the indentured women issue, away from victims or immoral beings and judging them and assessing them as laborers, as workers, as human beings who actually fought their way out of that. And I think it is very important for us to see it from that perspective also. But of course, not actually overlooking the overall exploitative uh, conditions that they faced.
Although single men and women were separated on board the ships, the horrors of sexual exploitation reared its ugly head regularly during the journey, which lasted between 1 to 2 months at sea. Some suffered in silence, whilst others challenged the atrocities until the bitter end. Violence, oppression, and sexual violation became a norm for many women. Women were seen as objects of sexual gratification, not only by the indentured men, but by the ship's crew, soldiers, and even the immoral doctors, who were seen as authoritative figures. Some women were forced to take on multiple sexual partners during their journey to Port Natal. Women who resisted were punished, starved, and some even resorted to suicide by jumping overboard. Let's for a moment try to understand the emotional and mental state of these women who saw suicide as a means of escape versus continuing to endure the horrors aboard these ships. We now cross over to Dr. Nancy Moodley, clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist based in Umhlanga, KwaZulu-Natal, who shares her insight on the social emotional dynamics of these women, including the long-term effects of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD.
Vanakkam, Namaste, Namaskaram. Assalamu alaikum, Sanbonani. Greetings to you all. The psychological impact due to the hardship, pain, and suffering endured by the women of indenture during their journey from India to South Africa would have been huge. The inhumane conditions that they were subjected to, together with the witnessing of their fellow passengers and loved ones, abuse, rape, exploitation, murder, suicide, and dead bodies lying around them, would have not only left them devastated, but also highly traumatized. Further, the patriarchal culture of their time would have placed them in the most vulnerable position. Faced with such atrocities, torture, and torment, it is most probable that high rates of mental health conditions, such as major depressive disorders, mood disorders, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder were prevalent in women. Further, research all over the world has shown that women are almost twice as likely as men to develop depression. In the late 19th century, mental health conditions were viewed as something demonic or supernatural. With such a lack of understanding and awareness, even if mental health conditions existed, they would have not been recognized and treated. This would have further exacerbated the plight of these women. With such hopelessness and having no reprieve in sight, could have resulted in some women trying to escape or wanting to end their lives through suicide by jumping into the ocean. Further, the long-term effects of untreated mental health conditions, such as PTSD, depression, and anxiety, can lead to cognitive deficits and decline, such as memory loss and poor executive functioning. Studies both internationally and locally has shown this association. Local research, which I had the privilege of presenting in New Delhi, India, highlighted the link between PTSD and declining cognitive functioning. Many women of indenture would have landed here in South Africa, a foreign country and foreign life, in a weak and mentally fragile state. It must have taken them great courage and resilience to heal from their trauma and rebuild their lives. We have evolved in so many ways with the advancement of diagnosing and treating mental health conditions, that the women of our generation are in an advantageous position to overcome their difficulties and lead better quality of lives. Not all women of indenture would have succumbed to their abuse and oppression. As this inspirational quote states, "It is the same boiling water that softens the potato, hardens the egg." There were those women that had strength, courage, and resilience, who stood up and rose above their circumstances. There are many women who became stronger and resilient because of their situation. It is these women, our great-great-grandmothers, who fought against their oppression and made ultimate sacrifices that paved the way for us modern-day women to become independent and successful in all spheres of our lives. Here in South Africa, the land of our birth. Nandri Vanakkam, Siyabonga. Thank you.
The Truro departed Madras on the 12th of October 1860, arriving in Port Natal first on the 16th of November 1860, carrying 342 passengers on board. The Belvedere departed Calcutta on the 4th of October 1860, arriving in Port Natal on the 26th of November 1860. Upon arrival, the Indians were ridiculed and gawped at due to their strange appearance. They disembarked at the depot at the point. The Indians were referred to as coolie, a derogatory word for low-wage laborers, typically of Indian and Chinese descent. The Indenture then proceeded to the quarantine station on the bay side of the Bluff Headland area to be processed before awaiting dispatch to their respective employers. People who were found to be unfit or disabled were sent back to India. Upon arriving in Port Natal, women continued to be placed at the bottom of the class, gender, and race hierarchy. As workers, they were further exploited and subjected to extraordinary burdens. Women earned half the amount paid to men. food rations were only given to working women, and all women over the age of 13 were required to pay a £3 tax, and failure to comply resulted in imprisonment. In the evenings, these women were still expected to cook, perform household chores, and to provide sexual services. Now, due to the disproportional gender ratio, women were frequently required to assist other men with domestic chores at their homes. This was also conducted in return for favors such as food rations or clothing.
Overworking of women was a common practice, including women who were in the various stages of pregnancy. Many women were forced to work until the 7th or even 9th month of pregnancy. Many would deliver the baby and in certain cases would return to work almost immediately thereafter. Globally, 3 to 4 months is the standard practice for postpartum recuperation, including maternity leave. Now, can you imagine leaving your newborn baby unattended in a hut, whilst only checking on him or her intermittently throughout the day, including moments to breastfeed? This was a shocking reality to many an indentured mother.
At the workplace, there was both conflict between male laborers and colonial masters, as well as collusion for control over indentured women. Sardars were frequently employed to oversee female workers, both at the workplace and in the barracks. It is no surprise that these Sardars used their position of power to further abuse these women and subject them to indignities. As alluded to earlier, the marked gender imbalance within the Indian population led to men asserting their claims over women with possible promise of marriage. However, a £5 marriage license was required in order for a marriage to be legally recognized, unaffordable to many. Marriage by customary religious rites was not considered valid. The ironic injustice, though, was that Indian men did not hesitate to resort to colonial means of justice in their attempts to assert control and punish women during cases of desertion, suspected adultery, and a breach of promise to marry.
A woman found guilty of adultery was punished by having her hair cut off, as well as 10 days of imprisonment as dictated by the colonial law at the time. Should she wish to commence a relationship with a different man other than her husband, she was expected to pay a £10 fine to her husband. The woman was imprisoned until she repaid the money or returned to her husband, even though he may be abusive. The question we ask is, what if the woman caught in this alleged compromising situation was under the threat of her colonial master or even a Sardar? Remember, many of the women lived and worked in constant fear, and their complaints were often on deaf ears.
The appalling practice of child marriages did not stop at the docks of India, but persisted among certain Indians within the colony of Port Natal, largely due to, once again, the gender imbalance in the colony. 13 was the legal age for marriage, although many brides were between the ages of 10 and 12. Some immoral guardians sold their young daughters, whereas others resorted to marrying them off twice, one by religious rites and the other to another person for an additional fee. The young girls often had no say in the matter and would be beaten if they attempted to defy their fathers. Their husbands were often much older and abusive. So we ask ourselves, what were the contributions of these fiercely brave women during this historical context of dehumanizing indenture? They left behind a legacy, and their sacrifices helped to mold a nation. Under the oppressive hand of indenture, many became resilient wage earners, developed their independence, and empowered themselves with both financial and social freedom. They challenged gender roles, and in the words of Gurudev Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, what makes a society strong and harmonious or otherwise depends on the role of women in it. Velama R. Munuswamy Mudale was the daughter of veteran passive resistors born in Johannesburg and was the first child activist to join Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha movement. She was arrested and sentenced to 3 months of hard labor and died from an illness that she contracted in prison shortly after her release on her 16th birthday. Dr. K. Gunam was the first Indian woman doctor qualifying in Edinburgh in 1934. She was one of the leading figures in the Natal Indian Congress, the NIC, and was imprisoned during the passive resistance campaigns of 1946 to 1948. She carved a niche in social welfare and women's organizations whilst in exile before returning to South Africa once the ANC was unbanned. She wrote in her book, The Coolie Doctor, quote, "I didn't feel I would be alive to see that day, to experience that incredible feeling of happiness. And so here I am at home. At home I will stay, in my country, till death do us part." Unquote. Her wish was granted, and she passed away in an apartheid-free South Africa on the 21st of September 1998 at the age of 92. Dr. Phyllis Naidu was born in 1928 in Escort, and like Dr. Gunam, she defied all traditional gender roles and not only qualified as a teacher, but as a lawyer too. She was also an author and university lecturer and a force to be reckoned with. She was a member of the Non-European Unity Movement, the Natal Indian Congress, the South African Communist Party, and Umkhonto we Sizwe. In 1990, Naidu returned to South Africa from exile and continued her spirited fight for the liberation movement. In 2002, the Order of Luthuli in silver was conferred upon Naidu for her outstanding contribution to human rights and the struggle for liberation in South Africa. Naidu died at the age of 85. Many Indian scriptures honor the woman as the highest aspect of divinity, the Adi Shakti. This primordial energy, known as Shakti, is the life force behind all of creation. This is the power of women. We salute those who led and walked before us. Your sacrifices will not go unnoticed. Those women who contributed to the building of this nation of South Africa nearly 163 years on. You strike a woman, you strike a rock. Thank you for watching part 1 of the Women of Indenture. Watch the space for details of part 2 as we uncover further atrocities in the British colony of Port Natal with me, Leena Bechu.